In the empty halls of what looked like an abandoned clinic, Kai Chisaki sat peacefully with his eyes shut on one of many empty seats that lined its walls. He breathed calmly through his newly acquired face mask, surprised by its fit on him despite his sessions with you back in Tartarus. He recalled the screams of all of the correctional officers and security personnel during that prison break, as well as the carnage that was left in its wake. You spared no expense in your team's efforts to free him from years of solitude. That tingling feeling returned on his shoulders. It happened every so often when he was subjected to only his thoughts and the four cold walls he was trapped in. Phantom pain, they called it. That's what you conversed with him for some time over the past 6 months, and how he dealt with such a blow to his operations, his plans, and himself in every way. The sound of a door caught his ear before he turned to find 3 young people in his periphery, recognizing them to be the ones responsible for shattering that thick-paned glass in his cell. They no longer had their masks, and freely walked towards him with a respectful bow, despite his deterred attitude.
"Sir, I'd like to be the first to say it's a pleasure to be in your presence,"
spoke Wires with a bow of his head.
"Let me introduce you to Wiz. Honored to meet you, sir,"
piped the young man next to Wires. Chisaki eyed the 2 of them with careful inspection, finding similarities in their physical appearance. Not identical, but he deduced.
"My brother. Twins.
Fraternal.
And this little thing is Zunder,"
continued Wires. Chisaki's eyes turned to the young girl before him, her smile wide and her eyes staring at him with admiration.
"You're like my hero!"
she cried, causing Chisaki to sneer at her somewhat unwarranted enthusiasm.
"Don't mind them, they mean well,"
reassured Wires.
"What are your names?"
asked Chisaki, earning confused looks from all 3.
"Your real ones."
"They are our names,"
replied Wiz nonchalantly.
"We have no other." What he means to say is that we go by no other but our call signs.
Reiterated Wires before he took Zunder's hand in his.
"Security, and we had given up our old ways for this new one."
Chisaki eyed all 3. Prior to visiting the abandoned clinic, he had been briefed on these members of your splinter group, learning that you had gained their loyalty over the years, and that it all started with this clinic. He knew the 3 before him were the youngest, Team Omega, and had the greatest potential to work alongside the others with ease, together or apart. He had learned about Wires early, for certain. The other 2, however, was a quick rundown.
"We better head, brother,"
informed Wiz.
"The train isn't going to wait for us."
Wires smiled languidly and agreed, all 3 leaving Chisaki while sending their farewells. All he did was watch them in silence as they exited the clinic, leaving him back to his thoughts and that phantom pain again. For a brief moment, the 3 distracted him. It was a comfort compared to the unnerving feeling on his upper arms. He could almost feel his hands again. Another door creaked before he spotted you removing your mask by the double doors that led through a large waiting room.
"She's here,"
you informed him.
"Ready?"
Chisaki stood from his seat and walked up to you, following you through the room towards what he assumed was an operating center of sorts.
"This is unbelievable,"
he commented, catching your ear.
"Can this doctor really fix this?"
You watched the stub of his arms move. It was almost sad to see him this way, knowing how you felt and saw him strapped to that bed in that terrible place.
I'm sure of it.
You responded confidently.
She's done more than return limbs.
It sounds like you know her personally.
Once upon a time, maybe. But I trust her.
Chisaki listened carefully to your voice, how it carried in its tone and inflection. Despite the confidence in it, there was something more that you didn't tell him. He knew this on the way to this clinic, yet you had reassured that the doctor would enlighten him if he ever had questions. Walking through the room, he eyed the rest of the splinter group recouping from his prison break. There were 6 others, some tending to wounds or otherwise minding their business. Again, Chisaki had a brief detail on each of them and had seen them in action. To think that he now had a small army on his side, it made him revive a little hope in his machinations and his agenda. On your way to the doctor, a tall man walked past, deliberately pushing against Chisaki's shoulders with his.
Watch it.
He snarled without turning his eye towards the former Yakuza leader. A show of distaste crossed the man's face, a sneer that curled his lips. Chisaki saw this, his cold golden eyes staring into the large back of his so-called assailant.
Please don't mind Alpha.
You reassured, Chisaki finding that you had stopped ahead of him, assessing the situation.
He is overprotective.
A little rough to hit a cripple.
Started Chisaki, his eyes still on the man who joined the rest of your team in the empty room.
He'll have to get used to it.
You reassured again.
Come on. She doesn't have a lot of time.
You waited while Chisaki still stood, watching him eyeing your team before he finally turned to join you. After recovering him from Tartarus, there wasn't much time to introduce him to every member of your team, but the rundown was enough to not leave him out of the loop. After all, once this meeting with the doctor was over, you hoped to revive his glory once again. Chisaki followed you into the operating room ahead, opening a set of double doors that swung with a loud creak. The room was cold, but compared to the rest of the clinic that was in shambles, the room was clean, spotless even, complete with an operating table and shelves stocked with a number of medical supplies. In fact, Chisaki noticed a shelf filled with plant life. A botanist? One specifically attached to flowers?
Kai Chisaki,
cooed a voice in the corner, catching Chisaki's attention away from the botany and onto a woman in a white coat. She turned to face him with a genial smile, stepping out into the light.
It's a pleasure to meet you. For what do I owe the pleasure of having company with a formidable leader?
Chisaki eyed the woman skeptically. He couldn't tell whether she was genuine or sarcastic until a small laugh bubbled from her.
I'm sorry. I heard you loved being praised,
she concluded.
Perhaps my timing is off.
Chisaki turned his attention onto you, warranting an urged look in his eye. 6 months learning about this man's mannerisms helped in understanding his tics.
Doc, he's ready to take the risk,
you informed her with confidence.
I've ran through with him what's required.
Very well. But there's no turning back when the procedure starts, she warned while she approached Chisaki, her eyes on him in his arms.
You know this better than anybody.
Chisaki's brow quirked at the doctor's words, finding your eyes pulled away from him. He couldn't quite place his finger on your response, but it looked a lot like shame.
You've gone through this before,
he stated, realizing your stance in the matter.
Yes,
You simply replied, your eyes still avoiding his.
you still have a choice though. I didn't.
Turning his eyes back to the doctor, Chisaki stood tall, staring into her somewhat warm gaze.
Before we proceed, I need to know one thing.
He started, piquing the doctor's interest.
You can revive my quirk after this.
Ah, I see you have been informed. To a degree, but it won't be the same.
Answered the doctor, straightforward and frank. She was only met by a silence, noticing the cogwheels turning in Chisaki's head.
You still have your quirk, just not the means to exact execution of it.
She continued.
You could go grab prosthetics, wait months for full functionality if any, and hopefully pray that your quirk can be activated through artificial vessels. Or take this procedure with the risk or reward of obtaining a more powerful, if not similar, quirk in the process. It is your choice.
Chisaki mulled over the words. He knew it was a test between patience and instant gratification. Eyeing your response didn't yield a result, only that you had confidence in this doctor for the one thing he wanted back.
Do it.
He ordered, finding a smile appear on the doctor's lips. She walked up to him with her hands open and bare until she stood there, her eyes staring into his.
You're going to have to fight for them,
she warned. Her hands immediately grabbed onto Chisaki's upper arms, her fingers clinging into his skin. Chisaki felt a searing heat from her touch, cringing in pain when a sudden burst of black light exploded from her fingers. His body was on fire inside, until his vision blurred. The cold ceiling above faded before the searing pain dissipated. He caught his breath again, now no longer in the operating room but staring up at the sky. A clear blue. The smell of burnt rubber filled his nostrils, the sound of distant traffic caught his ear. He turned to find himself laying on the ground in the middle of the asphalt, on top of a hard and cold surface, until he moved his arms, his hands bound by heavy cuffs. His eyes widened at the sight, witnessing his arms and his hands intact. However, he also recognized the scene around him. He was still in cuffs, tied to that metallic stretcher, lying on the street with plumes of smoke in the air from 2 vehicles that were transporting him to Tartarus. He was in this moment, his lowest point, broken without purpose. The sound of 2 heavy pairs of footsteps approached him from behind. There they were, the thieves that stole everything from him, standing above his bound form. The scene played out like it did years ago while he struggled to escape. The same words that were uttered replayed like a record. He knew what transpired next, struggling to free himself from his bounds.
No.
He cried while he continued to struggle, shaking his restraints. He watched that marble land onto his left arm, a searing heat stinging his skin before it was eaten and taken away. He hissed at the pain, and as if by clockwork, the next event transpired. Chisaki watched Tomura Shigaraki's hand lower onto his right. The touch of his fingers gripped against his skin and began to calcify, turning all matter to ash. He watched everything unfurl before his eyes, screaming and yelling to stop. What good was this so-called procedure for him to go through everything all over again?
You're going to have to fight for them.
The doctor's words rung through his head, feeling that searing heat return in his body, especially on Shigaraki's grip. Every moment that passed, his right hand calcified and decayed, pieces of it disintegrating slowly into the air. That heat burned through his shoulders, as if his nerves fired rapidly to transport it through his arm. He almost felt his fingers still, though his palms began to turn to dust. The sensations felt so new, after years of having none of these limbs. Despite the dust and ash of his skin floating away, he tugged and pulled at his arm. Shigaraki's hand still gripped onto it, his red eyes staring down at him with condescending distaste. With a violent pull of his arm, Chisaki freed himself from the heavy handcuffs, destroying the large hunk of metal into shrapnel. Fragments floated and danced in the air, ripping his arm from Shigaraki's grip. It must be a dream, he thought, staring at his arm half decayed and slowly falling apart. Everything seemed to stand still. Time had no meaning here, yet the heat became unbearable, stinging every fiber in his now intact arm. He inspected the origin of the decay, the fractures and fissures decorating its surface, yet a light flickered from within, a black sea of space dust and glow. He felt the heat radiate from it, keeping everything all together. Chisaki's eyes slowly turned from his arm to the man who stole everything, laughed at his misfortune, and left him with nothing. Shigaraki stood above him with his red eyes piercing into Chisaki's with glee. Without hesitation, Chisaki grabbed a hold of Shigaraki's wrist, now with a renewed purpose, while his arm burned and stung.
I will destroy you,
he threatened, the heat burning his insides through him and his arm.
Everything that you are, everything that you have taken away from me will be tenfold. I swear to you, Shigaraki, you will see your demise in my hands this time.
The black glow overflowed from the fissures before it erupted, imploding from the inside and smothering Chisaki whole. His sight of Shigaraki dissipated, absorbed into a sea of black. A burst of heat exploded from his shoulders before he stepped back from the sudden shock, finding himself being propped up by Yu from behind. His breath was heavy and deep. Sweat poured from his temples until his eyes spotted the doctor, her hands still colored in black light before it disappeared. There was that smile still on her face, yet her eyes were curious.
"Well, this is different,"
she uttered, her gaze drawn to Chisaki's side. He felt that phantom pain again, that shadow of his arm that persisted for years. Had it failed? Was the doctor not successful? He felt the tips of his fingers against his palm, curling and extending. It couldn't be, he thought, just his imagination playing tricks. Until he looked down to witness the remarkable. There beside him was his right arm returned, along with a minor scar from where he witnessed the decay from his dream. At least, he thought it was. He curled his fingers again, feeling his own skin at its tips. The sensations felt so foreign to him, so new.
Unfortunately, you didn't fight hard enough.
Chisaki briefly looked to the doctor, eyeing her gaze towards his left-hand side, finding nothing there.
Do it again,
he demanded.
I'm afraid not. There will be consequences,
she explained.
It was enough to bring one arm back, and not all intact.
Chisaki eyed his right arm again, spotting the scar that fissured outwards from a focal point.
What consequences?
The doctor sighed, eyeing you next to Chisaki with a smile, one that was unnerving and yet knowing.
You could lose your quirk entirely,
you answered, earning a glance from Chisaki.
The doc can help you gain an artificial one if you want to undergo further procedures, but otherwise, you'll lose a part of you
to gain something back, interrupted the doctor.
Like alchemy, an equivalent exchange must be met. We're not even sure how much of your quirk was affected.
With a swipe of his right arm, Chisaki reached out towards the doctor with a flick of his wrist. A splash of her arm exploded from her person. Her blood smeared in her once pristine room. You jumped from the sudden outburst, watching Chisaki stand tall, admiring the splatter left behind.
Chisaki, what have you done?
You asked, staring at the blood that dripped from the doctor's shoulder. Chisaki stared at her with an inspecting eye, ignoring your concerns, listening to heavy pained breaths instead.
Does that answer your question?
He asked with spite.
Now, return my arm.
The dripping from the doctor's arm echoed lightly in the stark room until all matter that Chisaki had destroyed began to glow. Light particles dispersed from the floor and the walls, floating back towards the doctor as if they were fireflies. She breathed deeply from the pain, yet grinned through it, the lights flickering as they formed back to shape.
I could try again,
she started while the light surrounded her shoulder, reconstructing her missing limb.
But I work through biology. Our quirks are genetic, a part of our DNA, and when one wants to reconstruct a part of their DNA, such as a missing limb, I need to graft it somehow.
The light formed the skeleton, its bones moving before muscle and sinew began to connect them together.
Your quirk is the only expendable part of your DNA. Otherwise, you'd be missing a leg.
With a twist of her wrist, her skin manifested around the muscle and bone. Her arm good as new. She eyed her coat, noticing the sleeve torn from it and sighed at her thoughts.
Well, you owe me a new coat,
she teased.
But now that I've explained myself, it begs me to question the nature of your unfortunate dismemberment?
Chisaki's eyes furrowed deeper at the question, his stare unnerving and insulted by the doctor's light-hearted tone. She continued to watch him, waiting patiently while he still opened and closed his right fist, feeling all sensations.
It was taken, stolen in a glass marble,
he responded with spite. The doctor's eyes raised slightly at the response with curiosity and intrigue. surprised by the answer for a brief moment, before she smiled genially.
I see,
She simply responded.
your left arm, I assume. Well, that answers all of our questions. I can't revive something that still exists.
What did you say?
Asked Chisaki, taken aback by such a statement. Again, that smile never left the doctor's lips, her eyes landing on yours instead.
No wonder it felt different. And I'm sure you know exactly where to find it, Major.
You watch the doctor smile at you in her prying eyes, her all-knowing tell in her look sparking a realization in your mind. You swallowed that anxious feeling, that lump in your throat choked up by the reality of the situation.
The paranormal liberation?
You uttered, concerned, unsure, but wary of the doctor's response, nodding in agreement.
You'll need to retrieve Chisaki's arm,
she continued to explain before her eyes fell back onto Chisaki's golden glare.
Then I can graft it back with no further developments. You've proven you can destroy matter. But what else can you do? Overhaul?
Chisaki's golden eyes flared in the fluorescent light, a smoldering anger bubbling from underneath that burned his core. He still needed to work to recover his glory, starting from scratch again. As infuriating as the thought was, that overwhelming feeling of helplessness coursed through his heart, and he hated it. He eyed that smile again. There was something unnerving about her, he thought, to not show any signs of fear from him upon first impressions. As if knowing and telling of his concerns, he watched her approach him casually and calmly.
Well, as your general practitioner, I suggest you make haste. Not sure what the state of your arm may be after this many years,
she advised.
The Major can escort you out.
She swiftly opened the door for both of you, watching Chisaki leave, then yourself in tow.
Don't be a stranger.
As soon as she offered the exit, she shut the doors behind you, leaving yourself and Chisaki to take the long walk back through the empty halls to the waiting room. You watched Chisaki's back while he walked down the hall, noticing his fascination with his now returned limb. You smiled inwardly, hoping that he was satisfied enough to have a part of him back. Still, the doctor's words recalled in your mind. You did learn about Chisaki's history, but he had never entirely explained how he lost his limbs. You only knew what had been informed by the law, and that there were no witnesses during the exchange between the League of Villains and Chisaki himself. To learn this way gave you some hope to help put him back together, but filled you with concern on methods how to retrieve that. Chisaki continued to stare at his newly acquired arm, flexing his fingers with disbelief. For so long he had accepted the fact of his arms being taken, but to be given one of them back despite the circumstances felt uplifting. Without risk there was no reward, and his burning desire for vengeance was as strong as the pain he felt during that unwarranted visit down memory lane. He stopped in his tracks, his back to you, unnervingly still.
Chisaki?
You asked, cautiously, slowing your step.
You know where my arm is?
He asked, ignoring your concerns.
Yes,
you slowly replied.
At least where it may be stored. I can arrange the rest of my team necessary for infiltration and retrieval.
Why did she call you Major?
The question took you back until Chisaki turned around to face you, his eyes roving and inspecting.
Tell me everything.
You're right. In the rush to get you here, I've only briefly introduced you to the others, and have not explained myself.
You agreed, standing tall.
My team calls me Major. It's my call sign. The doc liked the idea and had called me that since. Liked it so much that she took a moniker for herself when we're out and about in public. She loves her privacy.
Then tell me, why didn't you have a choice?
Chisaki.
With that doctor, why didn't you have a choice?
That lump returned in your throat, but you swallowed it back down, shaking your head.
A story for another time.
You murmured.
I'd like to get a start on locating your arm first, but we have to move and return to home base. It shouldn't take long.
You kept your gaze on Chisaki for a response, awaiting any command from him until he walked up to you, raising his hand towards your face. You felt how slow he approached, breathing deeply when you felt his fingers almost hover over your cheek. Your eyes held steadfast on his, holding onto his gaze that eyed you curiously.
You're not moving,
he stated, his fingers mere hairs away from your skin.
I'll move when you tell me to,
you replied, now with a gentle smile.
You're our leader now. I can advise what is happening, advise on your next move, but my goal has always been the same.
You slowly reached your hand up to his, yours now hovering over his palm, mere hairs away from touching.
Return your glory. Always has and always will be.
Slowly you wrapped your fingers around his hand with no fear in your gaze. Gently maneuvering it onto your cheek, you still inspected his reaction to your touch. After all, you were aware of his extreme germophobic tendencies. However, you spotted no aversion. Perhaps a moment of surprise and curiosity, but not a visible disgust from your movements. Your eyes broke away from him as soon as his palm cupped your cheek, holding onto his hand while you did. Thoughts of him pulling you apart had crossed your mind, yet it did not deter you. You had gone through so many reconstructions it didn't matter. Chisaki meanwhile watched as you melted into his palm. He had been surrounded by cold and callous members, some dim-witted ones as well, but never one that put all their trust and their livelihood literally in his hands. He fought an inner battle against your touch. Those 6 months in his cell had been a struggle to open up to you, let alone trust you, and yet he allowed his own skin to touch another. The lack of fear and concern he saw unnerved him, just as the doctor did. But this was different. There was a whole different emotion behind it, not with intent, but with something deeper. In the end, trust went both ways. You felt his hand press against your cheek, his golden gaze staring into yours before it trailed gently towards your jaw. His grip commanding and strangely tender. His gaze smiled at you despite the mask he wore, one with a rekindled light that you witnessed for the first time, drawing his face near.
Well then, my one and only Major, get your team together and find my arm.